Esquire of CultureWorks. Just about like how do we start a momentum of getting some of these ideas in one place together. And as I'm sure you'll say, this is certainly not like the only solution, but it's just one that we've been kind of kicking around and we thought like might be interesting to throw out there and just see how people react to it. And then maybe afterwards we can have a conversation about like what things about that are appealing, what aren't, and then maybe what are some other solutions that might be out there. So I will hand it off.
Thank you. I want to thank Adrian and Brad for inviting me. And I'll give a little bit of a brief bio since that's been part of the course. How many people have heard of CultureWorks? That's great. Wow, that's really surprising because we're relatively new on the scene. My background was as a composer and a conductor, and then a curator for a number of years, and then I gradually decided that I would be more useful not doing those things and being an administrator, which is basically what I am. Also very self-taught. I've been doing this for about 15 years, managing, curating, some combination of all of the above. Started a company in 2005 called Peregrine Arts that did management consulting, incubated a number of things, but principally a project called Hidden City Philadelphia, which we've now spun off and has its own staff and is a separate entity, and I very consciously decided that was not something I wanted to run, but do this instead. So CultureWorks is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation of its own, a successor to Peregrine Arts. And a lot of what we've been working on building, we've just sort of begun to, we've been incubating a lot of the ideas that I'm about to talk about since 2008, basically. There's been a lot of piloting and sort of experimenting, and we're just coming public now, sort of this summer, in that we've just launched a little beta site and so on and so forth. Pretty much everything before that as activity has not been marketed or sort of aggressively publicized. So the previous conversation was a phenomenal thing to listen to and a great introduction. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into the fiscal sponsorship pool, if you will, but the sort of background that Adrian presented on the evolution from sort of individual practices to what could come next was really sort of perfect as an introduction. So we built CultureWorks on this basic premise that it's not what you do, dance, theater, visual arts, in terms of discipline, but how big you are that really sort of determines the problems you have and how solutions can be delivered to you. We started out, and this is what we have sort of up right now. We have 3 programs with somewhat fancy names. Strategic Reinvention is really sort of for very large organizations, conventional management consulting. Out of that program came, some of you may know the Partners for Sacred Places, Arts and Sacred Places program. We did the research for that and also the program design for it. And that's now growing, and it's becoming, we hope, a great resource for Philadelphia. So that's an example of some of the work we're doing there. We're just starting business planning for the Elkins estate through White Pines to try to come up with a solution for that very troubled property. So that's sort of strategic reinvention. Management services, I'll talk about a little bit more in depth in the coming slides. Cultural co-working. We really reached for co-working. How many people here know Indy Hall? Okay, Indy Hall, Independence Hall. It's Philadelphia's sort of only true existing co-working space. It's an old city, founded by a really amazing guy, Alex Hillman. They are, how many people are familiar with co-working as a movement? Okay, some people. It's basically, it's a community-based shared management and shared idea type program, and it usually revolves around a physical space, like a shared management space. And it really does organize itself very socially around communities of mind. So Indy Hall is very tech and sort of programming centric. We're building one for the cultural community, the creative and cultural community. It's opening in October. It'll be 5,000 square feet on the 3rd floor of the Philadelphia building where the Cultural Alliance has just moved. We're taking basically half of that floor. Lease is signed. It's opening. It's a done deal. We're taking founding membership now through the end of September, basically, for that. You can have full-time office space down to transient membership at like $45 a month. You can come in and use the space and the copiers and all that kind of stuff. But that was something we really reached to from our management services program, which was really the sort of first thing to start. We started experimenting with, which was to a lot of the previous conversation. How can we take a bunch of staff and put them together and then rent them out? And we found that there's a very fancy word for that. It's called fractional services integration. So you can drop that at your next cocktail party. But it is exactly what some folks have been talking about here. You know, how can I get an eighth of an accountant and a quarter of a marketer and a third of a development person or whatever? And then furthermore, have all of those people be integrated with each other. Because the other big barrier we found was that you can kind of go out and source all those people, but then they all have to work together. It's a system. And we take a fundamentally whole systems approach to everything. If we're not sort of wrapping our arms around the whole entity, it's going to be less efficient. You know, because your development person has to, as many people pointed out, really understand and know the work to be able to talk about it and sell it to funders. That takes a long-term relationship. There also has to be an integration with that effort and budget and strategy and all of those things. So our view is that sort of whole systems are bust. You can't cherry pick what we do. You're in for a dime, you're in for a dollar. That's our sort of approach to it, which is why it's not the solution for everybody. Some people just want the accounting, and there are things like your part-time controller and there are freelance accountants and bookkeepers out there that are very fine who can do that for you. But we take a full integrated approach. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of what we're doing, and it is scaled down from sort of large to medium to small to very small and individual. And we've built these programs to be sort of different ways of delivering a whole systems kind of support to different size practices. Yep. Yeah, it's a good question, and we haven't put a bright line on it because there isn't a bright line. You know, this is a very sort of individual, this is not a retail kind of mass scale deliverable type support. Like Fractured Atlas, a lot of what they do is systemed to be able to be delivered online or at a distance. So we really have a conversation with somebody coming into our sort of membership. Budget, I would say, just to give an answer to your question, management services starts to make sense at about $100,000 in turnover a year. Below that, it really doesn't work. And one of the reasons is that for management services, we actually get into business with our clients, is exactly what was being said about Accenture. We do comprehensive financial management, development, board leadership development, all of those things. And we take a very big stake in the client and its future success or ongoing success. And there's a very basic economic formula at the heart of that. We want, like Accenture does, the people we're working with to cash flow positive so that they can pay our bill every month. We work on a monthly retainer basis. And we don't just say, if there's no money in the till, that's your problem. We're working with them to make sure there's money in the till. So it's a mutual self-interest. So we're very selective about the groups that come into that program. Co-working is really from anybody from $10,000 a year all the way up to, could be any size really, that has much more flexibility. The strategic reinvention program is organizations that are typically $500,000 and up. We don't work with organizations above like 14 or 15 million. That's like a whole different class, like the Kimmel Center is in the orchestra. So that's just to say that we're very small focused. And a lot of this was inspired by the data that we now have, thanks to the Cultural Alliance, that there are about 2,000 cultural organizations in Greater Philadelphia. 70% of them operate below $1 million a year, 40% below $250,000. And most of that long tail are the organizations that are invested in diversity of opinion and vision and experimentation and innovation, at least in our opinion. That's where you get that. Yet we've built very poor support systems for organizations of that size. As Adrian was saying, how do you scale down some of this stuff that seems unscalable? The attorney hour that's costing $4 an hour, how do you deliver that to an organization that's got $50,000? It seems a little bit out of whack to be spending $400 an hour for attorney when you pay your artists $20 an hour. You know, I mean, that kind of stuff is difficult to wrap your mind around. So we were really trying to figure out how do we take those kinds of services and scale them down for creating a system to do that. So it's not only budget, Anna, but it is kind of programming volume. Like you have to, for management services, also organizations that sort of have ongoing like seasons and programs. It doesn't really work for like somebody does like one project a year. And that's because a lot of what we do is like a monthly, weekly, we're the staff for an organization. And so to support that, there needs to be an ongoing kind of activity. Which again is why we sort of we reached for the co-working community, because a lot of people who did one project a year wanted something like management services, but couldn't afford, it wasn't in scale with their operations. And also just sort of culturally, operationally didn't work, because it really is like a month-to-month, week-to-week rhythm that makes that middle program kind of function. And it's taken us like 4 years to figure some of this stuff out, like what doesn't work. We've had some failed, clients in that program. So there's been a lot of learning around the middle, and we're just starting the co-working kind of experiment now. So it's also leadership is another big, what's the vision, who's behind it is a big decisive factor, but that has nothing to do with money. So our mission is really focused on resilience. Again, we don't think bigger is better, and sort of also have a big fig with the general culture out there that's somewhat supported by the funding world, that it's always about getting bigger in scale, and that we really feel you can grow horizontally. And in fact, most organizations, maybe 80% of cultural practice and up, is not really scalable. So the question is different. It's how do we continue? How do we do it 25 years from now or whatever? How do we know that? And that's really a question about resilience, not scale or structure. And resilience we define as the ability to kind of move, adapt, roll, and shake to a changing environment without encountering duress, without falling on your face, losing stakeholders, going into ridiculous debt. And so we're trying to build a conversation around this notion of resilience and have it be the definition of what constitutes health. That a resilient community is a healthy community, not a bigger community. It's not about sort of the amount of money or the scale or the amount or all the things that we tend to be obsessed with. It's about resilience. And how do we measure that, which is a big question we're trying to figure out. I don't need to spend a lot of time on this because we've talked about a lot of these, but these are sort of my opinion, our opinion issues. There are obviously many different views on some of these, but we talked a lot about the credibility issue, and we feel that the sort of nonprofit corporation as such is really not your credibility. It's you and your work, maybe a little bit of PR and branding, but it's really the work that is what people are responding to, not whether you have some piece of paper that says you're a 501c3. This issue of losing control, I said a few words about that earlier. We feel that that's not a major issue, although it comes up psychologically as a big barrier frequently when we're talking to people. And as Adrian has demonstrated, having you're a nonprofit or getting into that kind of business doesn't necessarily mean that things become cheaper because you're tax exempt. We've had a lot of people talk to us about that. And certainly getting donations and such isn't easier. You have access to donations, but you still somebody's got to do the work to go get them, write the grants, et cetera. So that should be pretty self-evident for everybody here. I didn't know how much information was going to be given, but this is again sort of familiar territory. Fiscal sponsorship is any time where there is a charitable entity, a sponsor, and I'm clarifying some language moving forward here, that allows a group, which we're going to call a project, doesn't have to be incorporated, to access charitable funds from funders and to kind of operate as though they're a nonprofit project. In exchange, there's some sort of administrative cost. As Adrian was talking about with NIFA and Fractured Out, there's different percent transactional costs. One really quick note, people call it fiscal agency or pass-through or conduit. These words get used a lot. And be very wary of them. They're actually, and I don't want to get into the legal reasons why, but they're actually incorrect, and funders will get very nervous. There's nonprofit law that explicitly the IRS prohibits pass-throughs or conduits. And if it's represented that way, that makes a lot of people very nervous. Agency is also incorrect for different reasons, so just wanted to clarify some language points. So there's a huge amount of literature on this, largely in the social services world, not in the cultural world. The people who really kind of came up with this, the genesis of fiscal agency and fiscal sponsorship, is really one of the social services community. And there are 6 ways of doing it. I'm not going to talk about all of them. We're just going to talk about 2. But just as a brief overview, there's comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, which is something that we're just about to get into, which is where everything, insurance, lots of other services are provided through the fiscal sponsor. There's the pre-approved grant relationship, which is the predominant model. That's NIFA's model. That's Fractured Atlas's model, where the legal structure is basically a re-granting agency. So those of you who know, like Mid-Atlantic Arts Foundation, or even the Center for Arts and Heritage of Pew is a re-grantor of the main trust, so there's an intermediary. The only way the IRS will allow fiscal sponsorship to happen in that way is to cast it as a re-granting structure. So you have grantors and grantees, and any of you are familiar with Fractured Atlas contract, it's sort of filled with all that kind of language. But that's how it's commonly done. And that is, even though we shouldn't call it that, sort of a pass-through type relationship. The money still has to go to an individual or corporation at the end of the day for distribution. Group exemption and supporting organizations, 2 seconds on that. Those are sort of like chaptered organizations. Any organization that has multiple bodies around the country, so it's one central nonprofit that has offices or outposts. And there are differences between 3 and 4 that are sort of not terribly relevant to our conversation. But these are all ways that an organization doesn't have to be its own independent nonprofit. Technical assistance is the sort of industry term for what we're calling management services. That's when you have a separate nonprofit and you're just renting staff for it. And it manages and is responsible 100% for all of its assets and its activity. All of our clients under the management services program, they control 100% their work, their money. They're responsible for their money. We just provide a series of services that are bundled to them. So that's the technical assistance. And the last one is a very exotic and recent one, actually initiated by the Mormon Church. So maybe we should beware. But they got through the IRS a kind of ruling where you can kind of be related to a charitable activity and still be able to write a gift or a contribution off your, be able to receive gifts and contributions and be able to confer the deductibility to the donor by sort of proxy. It's a very fuzzy sort of new thing. It's referred to as the for use of sponsorship. And the Mormon Church went after it so that all of their folks that go out and do the evangelical work could kind of get friends and family to sponsor that work for the church. So anyway, we do 2 of those 6. We're really focusing on 2. One, as I've mentioned, is this technical assistance model, which we call management services. Right now we have a group of 5 organizations, including Hidden City. Hidden City is actually, it's our only franking client that we sort of created, but is now also a client. But it is legally and wholly separate, has its own board, has its own corporation. There's a contract between it and CultureWorks for these services. We do everything from business and strategic planning to project development and management, leadership development. The biggest thing is comprehensive financial management and compliance, which we do out of our office. So we actually are the finance office. We take your check stock. We keep all of the physical files and electronic books at our location. It's not an outsourced service like YPTC, your part-time controller. Fundraising, marketing, and then a host of other things: assessment, research, partnership facilitation, which we've done a fair amount of. That's really a holistic kind of support relationship with that group. We currently do the pre-approved granting fiscal sponsorship model for about 6 projects. One of which is familiar to you now is White Pines. I'm just thinking about people who know what organizations folks will know. A couple music organizations. We're also currently the fiscal sponsor for White Box Theater and Sebastian One-Time's practice. She has a 501c3 that's pending right now. Our deal, though, is we don't do it as a retail model like Fractured Atlas. You have to either be working with us as a member of the co-working program or be a client of one of the other programs. So it's not something you can just kind of walk in off the street and get. We have to have a relationship with you. Currently, our rates are 7% for coworkers and 5% for other clients because those are much higher value and closer relationships. So you get a little discount on fiscal on the fiduciary side of things. And for that, it's pretty light. We're doing the accounting, we're doing the stuff that Fractured Atlas has to do. We're doing all the compliance work. Obviously, implicitly, you're getting oversight from our board and governance, but that's pretty much it for what we're doing right now as we sit here on the pre-approved granting structure. Any questions on some of this language? And I know I'm going really quickly, but if anybody has I don't know what the hell you're talking about, just stop me or throw a flag. We're building a program for comprehensive fiscal sponsorship because this seems to be, and it's great to hear a lot of your comments sort of affirming, there seems to be a really great need for this. And so this summer we're forming actually a 501c3 trust. It won't be a corporation. It's a separate entity from CultureWorks. It'll be governed by the same board in a sole member relationship. And again, it will only be available to co-working members and clients. There has to be an existing fundamental relationship with our community. And under the trust, we'll be able to do a lot more than just sort of the pass-through type work. Project planning and management will be implicit. All of the sort of financial and compliance stuff. We'll be able to offer comprehensive project insurance, general liability, D&O, and workers' comp. Also, as an option, payroll, if people want to pay people as W-2, and 1099 payment support, vendor contracting, and contract management. And there is also the possibility that we could create even a group healthcare plan for the members of the trust. Now, the critical difference between these two, in case this hasn't been clear in our conversations so far today, the pre-approved granting relationship has a bunch of middle steps and middle people. You start with the funder, it goes to the sponsor or the grantor. This is the Fractured Atlas NIFA model. It then goes to the project, so then it hits Adrian's social security number, or an LLC or an S Corp or something that somebody stood up to receive the money. And then that entity pays all the artists, the contractors, the venues, what have you, right? And what that means is that all the liability for those vendors and those contractors hits the project, the grantee, not the grantor. And that's the reason why Fractured Atlas and a lot of these folks don't want to do that, because it's a tremendous liability. HR liability is one of the most toxic kinds of liability. Because the moment you write a check to somebody, you're not only on the hook for the taxes and the various other things, but you're also open for wrongful termination, sexual harassment, any kind of other types of exposure out there that have to do with HR. It's you. And that's one of the biggest risks. I mean, not that we all hope to have good relationships with everybody we pay and work with, but these things come up. And particularly if you're doing it at a huge scale where you don't have a touch to the people you're working with, it's a monstrous liability. So at the volume that Fractured Atlas works, they could never take on that liability. They probably could never even get insurance for it. So it has to be a closer in kind of deal. Comprehensive fiscal sponsorship is there's a big difference. It's a huge leap. That's when the sponsor, in our case, the trust, is the direct contractor. We are your company. And so the project is internal to the organization. So you don't have to set up any kind of corporation or anything. You can be just John or Jane Q. Public with a social security number and be the initiator of a project. And you have certain limited instructive rights, similar, not actually, ironically, not much different than the pre-approved grant structure to kind of control the money that's coming to the sponsor. But the trust will directly pay all the bills. So you don't...
Same grants. You go to both of these things.
Correct.
So if I apply for a grant in either of these, it's same grant, assuming that the grantor is
Right.
willing to, the funder is willing to fund that grant.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we found out, we had a meeting with the Philadelphia Foundation last fall, and we asked the question, like, why are the funders uncomfortable with the sort of reigning model, this pre-approved grant relationship? And the answer is all the middle people. They would be much more comfortable if there was no pass-through. And that's the biggest thing that's hanging them up right now in terms of shifting their policy. And there's a little bit of like a Mexican standoff happening right now between the cultural community and the funding community, because the funding community, as was said earlier, doesn't want a lot of new nonprofits, but at the same time they don't see any like entity out there with which they could partner to do fiscal sponsorship in a way that they would like to do it, which is not the pre-approved granting relationship. They want the sort of comprehensive fiscal sponsorship relationship where the money's going into a legal nonprofit's bank account and never leaving until it hits the end source. That's what they want. It's a security issue, and it's, you know, it's a fiduciary issue. They don't want all the possibilities in between for something to go sideways. So we sort of feel that if we can build this thing in the CFS model, that funding policy might, at least locally, I mean, this isn't going to rock the world, but you know, that some funding policy locally might be able to shift and be more open to this kind of relationship. There are people, by the way, that do this. Like the Tides Foundation has been doing comprehensive fiscal sponsorship for 35 years. The Greater Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition has been doing it for over 30 years as well, but predominantly for the social service sector. They have almost no penetration into the cultural sector, but they've built this already. They do it for 75 organizations they have in their membership. I don't think we can build it. I don't think that scale has a lot of problems, and they've run into a lot of those in more recent years. We don't see this getting to that kind of scale. But it certainly could be a solution, and hopefully shift some of the funding thinking out there to be more open. Now, whether we can move Pew's thinking on something like this is a completely other issue. But is all that clear in terms of those two, the differences between the one and the other?
Do you also, not just grant money, but do you take like earned income that I don't want to, so it's like, I want to divide it up amongst an ensemble, can I put it through that as well?
Yeah, I mean, the common model for comprehensive fiscal, that's an important distinction. Most of the pre-approved grant structures, they're only taking in contributed revenue, so it's only donations and grants because you don't need to have earned revenue go through a nonprofit. But for comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, because it is your corporation, everything goes through it. Because the deal is that, you know, the project is still responsible for a lot of the fundraising lift and the marketing lift, but the trust or the CFS sponsor won't write a check unless there are funds in the bank.
It's almost like a bank account.
It is a bank account, except there is one thing that for instance, GPUAC does this, and there's a good set of policies that we're considering that would allow us to even manage. Certainly, there's no reimbursement type, so that whole issue of like, you know, the back and forth, because that doesn't even involve you. You're out of the equation. But even if you have a grant receivable, like say, for instance, the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts, or more to the point, the Cultural Fund, which I'm sure a lot of people here go to, and you get your letter in whatever February, and then, you know, there's all kinds of nonsense, and then you get your check in March or April or something. A lot of CFS organizations will write checks. They keep a buffer amount of money, sort of basically a small reserve, so they can write checks against pledges and basically do very short-term bridge loans. So if you have a letter from the cultural funds that says, I'm getting $5,000, the trust could write money on your account in advance of getting the cash, knowing that there's an actual credible pledge out there. Now, we wouldn't do that with just anybody off the street. You want to make sure that it's somebody who's, you know, likely, you know, so you can't get your parents to say, well, I promise, you know, to pay. But if it's a state funder or a recognized, you know, foundation that just you have the play, or even like a, you know, a William Penn grant where it might be paid out over periods of time, there might be the option to kind of play with that.
You basically get a checkbook or a card that you use. I mean, 'cause you don't have to lay out money.
No, you don't. You and
buy something, I can pay for it. That's how it works.
well, I mean, that's the only. There is no card. I mean, you would have to take out, and how we do sort of COD type stuff for that kind of thing. We're still trying to figure out what the best model for that is. But you instruct the trust as to what you want to have paid when, and the trust has to approve those. But you're still sort of driving your project, and the you become what in the legal sense is it's called a protector of the trust. And you have your own subtrust, which is a separate set of books that are just yours, set up underneath the overall organization. So every project has its own set of accounts and whatnot. You know, we're looking into some ways that there could be automated online systems where you could just log in and check your account and see how much money you have and things like that to make it easier. But the COD side of things is a little bit more challenging. I mean, that may be an instance where you have to front the money. But if it's something where you can say, I need, you know, so-and-so paid, or I need this contract paid out, that contract's going to be with the trust, not with you anyway. You know, you're saying, these are my artists, we want a contract. And so we're also talking to a company that does automated online contract delivery like LegalZoom, but better, about doing a suite of contracting instruments for the arts and culture sector. So commissioning, trademark license, performer agreements, all that kind of stuff. That could be associated with this, and you could just go online and sort of fill out the information, and boom, it does it, and it would be with the trust.
So say you had a nonprofit already. Why wouldn't you just dissolve your nonprofit and have the comprehensive fiscal sponsor?
Good question. Well, actually, there are some of the work that Tides has done on this particular kind of sponsorship has. They've looked at legacy nonprofits, like nonprofits that have reached this like critical moment and they've teetered or they've collapsed, and they. It doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have a nonprofit. What they've found people doing is sort of putting their nonprofit on ice, not necessarily formally dissolving it, but basically emptying its bank account, putting it into the comprehensive fiscal sponsor, allowing them to essentially operate that nonprofit's work. And then they'll and they use that kind of surrogate to figure out what they want to do with the nonprofit eventually. So sometimes that might be a prelude to a merger. It might give them a little bit of stability to operate it while they're trying to figure out what to do. Do they want to take it a different way? And then you can always uncouple and go back and continue on. I mean, it's a plug-in, unplug scenario. And that's one of the benefits of it, because you're not obligated to be in for life. You're only in for whatever transactional stuff is going through the books. So this is a maybe a little bit obscure. I put this together this morning with not enough coffee yet. But sort of comparison between the three options that have been on the table today: the sort of independent organization, separate entity, yes, it's its own thing. Its relationship to everybody else as an employer, employee, or a contractor, right? Everything that the organization makes belongs to the organization. The donations belong to that organization. And 100% of all the liability for that stuff, insurance, et cetera, attaches to that organization. Projects are 100% owned by the organization, and organization has everything for compliance. In contrast, I just want to kind of flip down to the third one. For the CFS sort of solution on the bottom row, obviously there's no separate entity. The CFS sponsor is your entity. It's employing and contracting everything. The donations legally do belong to that sponsor. The biggest difference, as you can see, between the pre-approved and the comprehensive is the liability issues, because all of that liability that you take on now falls to the sponsor and is their responsibility. Project ownership, and this is something we haven't really talked about today, but that's actually a really big issue. Who owns the IP? And this is even a big issue for like founder-driven. I'm curious how headlong, a lot of this ends up being very informal, but technically anything that's paid for by the nonprofit doesn't belong to Amy Smith as individual artist. It belongs to Headlong Dance Company as a non-for-profit corporation, unless there's an agreement between the individual artists, like in a commissioning arrangement, that clarifies what the ownership is. Like we own it together, or you own all of it, or I mean, there are all different ways you can do that. There's a lot of flexibility with the CFS relationship. Just to be clear about like our aspirations, we have no interest in owning IP or artistic content in setting this up whatsoever. So we're probably, even though technically it would be the property of the trust or the property of the CFS sponsor, whoever they would be, if it's somebody else, we just don't see that being the purpose of doing this. So that's one thing that we're, just to be clear on. In the pre-approved grant relationship, that usually ends up being the grantee, you as at the end of the road. Again, as we talked about before on the compliance side, that's really split. The sponsor, like Fractured Atlas, does the 1023, and the BCO, for those of you who don't know it, is the Bureau of Charitable Organizations, which is actually the regulator of nonprofits. It's a common misunderstanding, but nonprofits actually aren't regulated by the IRS or the federal government. They're regulated at the state level by what is the equivalent of the SEC. You have to file with them once a year, and they give you your license to solicit charitable funds. And they're getting very nasty these days, almost as nasty as the SEC. So for comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, of course, that's the sponsor that's doing all that compliance work and filing with the IRS and everything else, whereas with the pre-approved grant relationship, it's split. You still, as everybody was saying, still get stuck with all these taxes and complications, and then you have to go hire Amy to sort them out. And fill out your, yes, exactly. All of that stuff. Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. So do those that sort of quick and dirty comparisons and some of the big differences make sense? Any questions on that front? And as you can see, there's a lot of similarity between the independent organization and the comprehensive fiscal sponsor. They're almost the same, except for the ownership issue, which has to be clarified in the relationship and the degree, but they're almost the same. Except one you can walk away from, and you don't have to wind up. That's the only difference. So these are just a few of the benefits that we see. As I said, you can remain an individual or a group without any tax liabilities other than your personal stuff. Like, you still have to pay your personal taxes on whatever you receive in the process, and you may still have to have your own insurance for whatever it is, life insurance, health insurance. You can get project insurance through the trust. Pooling risk on insurance is a big thing. There are a lot of theatrical, particularly for workers' comp, which is the only statutorily mandated kind of insurance. And people are cracking down on this a lot. It doesn't matter if you're W-2 or 1099, you must insure everybody you pay who is a natural person. That's also a misunderstanding. People say, well, everybody I'm paying is a 1099. I don't have to insure them. False. I mean, it's a gray area, but you can really get hammered by not doing that. And workers' comp is rated based on what you're doing. And theatricals, which everybody in this room would fall into, is one of the most expensive kinds of workers' comp insurance you can get out there. For very small companies, sometimes you can't even get it written because the underwriters don't even want to deal with it. It's too much liability for too little money. So by pooling everything together, it's like group health insurance. You can get access to that insurance without having to deal with difficulty in underwriting. All of your costs are transactional. You're not fronting money. The costs are coming out of any kind of cash that's hitting the books. Short-term cash flow, talked a little bit about that. One of the biggest things, and this is also really the model that built the GPUAC, is that you can take all of that activity. So say there are 30 projects pooling funds through one comprehensive fiscal sponsorship, and then you've got $1 million. Say that's $1 million in turnover a year. That's the budget that goes to the funder. Okay, and so you have a different pro rata, and actually GPUAC they're a $35 million a year fund. They've been able to go out on behalf of their members and leverage enormous government grants. Now they deal with lots of social service organizations, so they're getting stuff from Department of Health and Human Services and things like that. That's stuff that doesn't exist, unfortunately, for the arts. I mean, we're never going to really do this for the NEA or the NEH. But there are certain funders where that scale gives you some leverage as a group. And that's another kind of potential hidden benefit of doing the sort of CFS model. These are not final, but these are sort of we've taken a pass. You're getting sort of a sneak peek, and don't hold me to any of these fees because they're not approved yet. But this is what we're looking at as a kind of financial pro forma or model for this kind of work. So if you want to know what this is going to cost, we're taking a very different approach than any other CFS companies we know. We're taking a sliding scale on the logic that the smaller you are, the bigger the fee. Like GPUAC charges you 10% base, no matter how big you are. You know, so if you're and as you get really small, like if you're turning $10,000 through the system, that's actually a lot of money relative to the size of what you've got. So we've sort of taken a graduated approach to playing with some pricing models for this. If you come into the CFS model, you have to pay the base admin, which gets you a lot of support, as you saw earlier on one of the earlier slides. You must pay for insurance. That's not an option because we're insuring your project. Like that's mandatory. And D&O, you pay D&O, for those of you who don't know, it is directors and officers insurance. So there's actually the boards of directors need to be insured and indemnified, and that's a separate class of insurance. And WC is workers' comp. So general liability, directors and officers, and workers' comp is included. Workers' comp is just passed through. So that depends entirely on how many people you pay, and we just pass that through. We're not marking that up or anything. Optional is our contracting services and payroll. I mean, this is a construct right now in terms of how we're forming this. So you can see on the right what the cost ranges would be per year. Extreme bottom and extreme top for each of the ranges of budget. So if you're putting $10,000 through the trust, it's going to cost you $750 to get all of that. I shouldn't say 3 year, but this is, if you take all these numbers in per annum. And if you're doing close to 100, it's only $7,500.
But you would take that out of the trust. Is that in addition to the?
No, that's the transactional fee for that amount of money. So if $100,000 goes to the trust, $8,750 of it goes for paying for all that other stuff. And that's basically, instead of doing it all yourself. And that's basically the model. And we're assuming in this, the numbers there don't include payroll costs, which would be passed through. So you'd be responsible for the employer's match taxes as well as the transactional fees for the payroll company. We won't do that internally. That will be contracted out to a payroll company. But all those numbers include, assume 50% of what you're paying is being paid to people. So you're paying for, so 50% of that $10,000, $5,000 of it is being calculated as a workers' comp, insurance. So that's also, the workers' comp is included in there as well, at 50% of what you spend. That may vary, that's just an assumption. So it's saying that of $10,000, $5,000 is going to production or other companies or corporations, and $5,000 is going to people, be they W-2 or 1099. We'll have to play with this over time to figure out how it works, but that's at least the current thinking in terms of how we might run costs on this overall. As I said, GPUAC and some of the other CFS sponsors, they have one, their model is they charge 10% as a base and then 1% for general liability and 1% for D&O, and then they pass through workers' comp.
Can you define that acronym again?
A GPUAC, it's the Greater Philadelphia Urban Affairs Coalition. And as I said, they do this for a lot of social service organizations. So, they're around. So that's a quick overview of what we're working on, and we're not. There's nothing really here to sell, but we are starting to put together a group of people who can be a founding. It's not really membership, but a founding group of interested projects around the trust, because we'll use that group to go to the IRS with it. Where the corporation's being formed now, it still has to go through the 1023 process with the IRS, and it's going to be faster and easier if we do that with a group of actual projects we're doing this with. So where we are in this process is we're gathering people around the table. It's not going to be limited to those people. It's not a closed door. It's just we need a sort of critical mass of folks to do it with before we can really get it through the formation process. So that's kind of where we are and what we do.
We were at 6 o'clock.
Sorry, I'm long-winded.
No, if you came down to the building, I think we can hang out a little, just sort of informally talk, but we are.
Sure.
So we can informally hang out and chat with that is and ask questions.
I mean, and this is certainly not the only model. I think it's one of I think that part of what we do is actually I was just looking at the cultural work website, and I was like, I want management services, but I'm not a small nonprofit.
Right.
So we just went and had a conversation about like, well, what's a way to think about like a bank account that is not in my social security number, or bookkeeping that I pass off to somebody that I actually trust and know. How can I start to leverage some of these kind of legal things? So it's certainly not the end of the conversation, and I imagine that this is probably a kind of meeting that I would like to see foster more dialogue on. Because 3 hours is certainly not enough to lock that down. But I really think everybody who came out will definitely be we'll be posting all of the notes that we had or that has been passed along to me. We're going to put the video of this online. We're going to create a transcript of it to send to all the folks that weren't here. It's super helpful, and I think the fact that there are so many people here just shows this an idea whose time is very much now.
Thank you for making it happen.
Thank you.
Yeah.